All right, we are back for another episode of the TFD Performance Podcast. Joining me again on the podcast, we've got Mike Piekarksi from originally California, all the way down in Washington now. Did you say, Mike, that you're living?
Well, I am now in Eastern Washington. That's correct.
Eastern Washington, I haven't heard of it. How do you break up Washington into subdivisions? Is it like north, south, east, west? Or I've only really ever known it as Washington.
Well, I mean, you think of Washington, you think of Seattle. It's like you think of California, you think LA. So it's like there's more. It's like a pretty big state. So I'm on the complete other side, as far away from Seattle as you can get.
Yeah, that's such a dumb touristy question. Hey, like people always say that for like Australia, and they're like, "Do you live in Ayers Rock in the middle of the outback?" And you're like, "No, no one lives." But anyway, mate, what you've been busy? We were talking about it off air there, but it's been about 2 years since we spoke last, and I feel like your presence online, everything that you're doing is just amplified and blowed up to a huge proportion nowadays.
Yeah, it's definitely been growing for sure. Yeah.
But let's talk about it. What are you doing now? So you moved to Washington. What's making up most of your days? You've obviously got Doctor Kickass on social media, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners that are listening to this are very familiar. What's happening with Doctor Kickass? What's happening with the rest of your life? Are you still doing clinic? What's happening?
Yeah. So this year I started my own business. It's like a sports performance business for combat athletes. So whether, I handle a lot of different things. So it's whether it's strength and conditioning, it's mobility, it's joint health, it's injury management. There's a lot of people out there that like go through traditional physio and like they don't work with someone who understands physical therapy. So they're like, man, like I want to get back to jiu-jitsu and I got discharged and I'm not quite there yet. So I kind of like help fill that gap of when they're, done with traditional physical therapists, but not quite ready to get back to sport. And you know what it's like most jiu-jitsu athletes are like, well, I can't raise my arm overhead. It hurts, but I'm going to go roll anyway. Like, no, you should not roll. So that's kind of like one of the main things I'm doing. I do work part-time in the clinics. I do see people in real life. And then kind of a new cool side project that I'm working on now is going to be a continuing education course for physical therapists, rehab specialists, which is going to be treating the combat athlete. Because so often I get people who message me on Instagram and like, look, like, where can I get more resources? Unfortunately, there's nothing out there. Like everything that I got is because I'm a nerd and I go through the research and I'm trying to gather everything I can. So I figure I'm just going to put it in one big platform and then I can kind of spread it that way.
Let's dive into that, Mike, because that's so true. It's so true for pretty much every area of combat sports science, right? It's the same for diet, nutrition, try to look for resources, just not there. What were some of the main things that you found when you started out in this area and you're starting working? Like, obviously you're an athlete yourself, so you would have experienced it and gone through it, but where were the biggest discrepancies when you were like, okay, I'm getting injured and I'm looking for information, but there's just nothing there?
So, well, a lot of people come to me specifically because they get frustrated when they go to any medical professional and they're like, well, they get their knee popped in a heel hook and they're trying to describe it. And the people they're looking at have no idea what they're doing. So some of it is like me to try to like bridge that gap. So like, be like, well, if you're a physical therapist and you don't understand combat sports, I'm like, this is what they're talking about. So then kind of like the next step is when it comes to return to sport, the demands are different because most research out there on return to sport is for like a field athlete, like whether it's football player, soccer player, et cetera. But like not like combat athletes are different. Like you're just doing things slightly different. So, and a lot of it is the movements required for grappling is vastly different because like you look at like the guard, then you look at a running athlete. So you have people do, and I still use a lot of classic orthopedic return to sport testing because I do think it has value. But there's more to it that like one of the most simple things that people come to me is like, I just had a knee injury and I can't kneel. Well, we know you have to kneel for jiu-jitsu because you're going to be in someone's closed guard. You have to do combat based knee slicing. Like it's all there. But, something simple like that, like how do you get back to kneeling? And, and I think one of the things that I do it's not just that I understand combat sports, but again, I do a lot of research on how do we optimize joint health. And, like a lot of people just try to like stretch their quad, but I'm like, the quad isn't limiting them from kneeling. There's something in the knee joint that's the problem. If that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. Let's go into that because that's interesting. And I think for
Yeah.
jiu-jitsu specifically, right? Like, and we were talking about before, white belts, you just, when you're a white belt, you're injured all the time. One, because it's new movements that you're trying to get used to. And like you said, like there's all these strange stresses that are going through your body. I think it's almost too late. I always think to athletes, like it's too late. Once you're injured, you got to deal with that injury. And that's like the pure focus. What you should be doing is almost that prehab, right? But when you, again, like we go to look around, you type that into Google, prehab for jujitsu, nothing pops up. Are there common or are there the most bang for buck exercises or things that you can be doing if you're a jiu-jitsu guy, not even if you're a white belt, if you're pretty experienced in the field and you're like, man, I need to bulletproof my body so I'm not getting injured. I'm not spending 6 weeks just rehabbing to get back to kneeling. Are there main big bang for your buck exercises or principles that these guys can be doing?
That's a tough question because I kind of look at it 2 different ways. So there's 2 ways you can answer it when it comes to like an exercise, right? So there's specific patterns that have a lot of crossover from athletics. So we can look at like a hinge, which is like a deadlift. We could look at like a squat. We could look at a lunge. We could look at a carry, a push, a pull, because these are movements that can work on a lot of different athletics. So it's again good for just general strengthening. However, again, that's general strengthening, not specific training. And I think jiu-jitsu, specifically combat sports, is joint health is very, very important in the sense that, you know, you can be able to lift a lot in classic mid ranges, but a lot of the damage and injuries happen at end ranges. Like you take a Kimura, Americana, heel hook, like, you know, no, most people, if you said, do you train knee rotation? Most people don't know what the hell you're talking about. The knee doesn't have a lot of rotation capacity. That's why you can heel hook someone and there's a lot of damage. But you should understand that you can rotate the knee. So first we have to make sure I can do what the joint's supposed to. And then I can do, I guess like a concept I'll do would be like end range isometrics to then kind of like bulletproof those end ranges. If that makes sense.
Is that specific types of exercise? So say if we're looking at like a Kimura or something like that, or Americana even, are you doing like, okay, these are shoulder specific exercises, we're putting you at the end range and here's a whole program for that?
Correct. That's exactly what it is. Yeah. You know, and like, yes, like, you know, the fancy way to say like, hey, I'm trying to Kimura proof you or Americana proof you, but really like, this is just like good joint health. Like really everybody should be doing this, but it's, I think, more applicable for a jiu-jitsu combat athlete to be very strong and resilient at those end ranges, right? Because if you don't have, if you don't really train those end ranges, so when you're put in that range, whatever tissue's stopping that from that joint from like ripping in half is not adequately prepared for that stress, right? So what you do is first you have to make sure you have the movement potential. From there, once you have the movement potential, you can start to train it, which doesn't just create resiliency like your ability to create force, but the more that you stress that tissue, the more that tissue is going to become more resilient, if that makes sense.
Here's one for you, Mike, because I've thought about this a lot. So
Yeah.
anyone that does jujitsu, you'll know that there's guys that are just bendy people and you'll just put them in all weird positions. Like you can Kimura some guys and put full, what you think is full extension and they just won't tap. And you're just like, what the heck? Like this guy just bendy as. And then you'll get other guys where you move it just an inch and they're like, yeah, I'm done.
Yeah.
When we're trying to train that, is it true that, you know, traditional flexibility and stretching, that isn't as good as, say, if you've got a good tailored strength conditioning program, or is it a mix of the both, or what's your thoughts on that front?
So it's a mix of both. Like, so like if you look at like a lot of literature, when they look at like what is the best way to injury proof your body, strengthening has the most evidence, which kind of makes sense if you think about it, because the stronger you are, the better you are at absorbing force. Joint lock, or even like a traumatic injury, like someone like runs into your leg or something like that, you know, like we have to be able to absorb that force. If you can't absorb, if the tissue can't absorb the force, injury occurs, right? So most research that I've seen for stretching is kind of like, here's like some arbitrary stretches. So it's like, well, that's not really specific to jiu-jitsu. So like, it doesn't really kind of make sense. So for me, what I have to do is I have to make sure, one, you have the adequate mobility for whatever position you want to do. So when I say mobility, we can talk about passive flexibility. And then we want to start to develop control of that full range strengthen that end range and just have developed good body control so that, you take someone like BJ Penn, like one of the things they talked about was that he could put his he could scratch his ear with his toe. Well, what that he's describing is good active body control. Like first he has to make sure that his hip can bend that way, but then he also has to control that. And I think a lot of people that do like yoga or like traditional stretches, they just stretch, which is one component, but they're missing that second component, which is training actively that end range and that body control.
Where do you think the balance is between being strong and being mobile or flexible in a sport like jiu-jitsu? Because you always see these guys, like everyone that I know has a story of like the bodybuilder or powerlifter that comes into the gym, right? And you're like really jacked up, but then they get on the mats and you just see them getting, twisted, folded up, and they can't hack it. But if they get you in certain positions, you just can't move. Like it's all good arm barring someone, but you can't arm bar someone when they pinned you on your back and you can't move.
Correct. Yeah.
What's kind of the balance between being really strong and then being really mobile? How do you find that balance?
So that's kind of interesting, right? Because I'm doing like a research dive when it's looking at like the physiological characteristics that define a successful jiu-jitsu athlete. And I think jiu-jitsu athletes need a combination of both dynamic strength and isometric strength. So dynamic strength would be what most people think, like the bodybuilder, power builder, like you want to be strong. But then the isometric strength, which is the closest thing we can describe as like mat strength, right? Like if you look at me, like I'm not an impressive guy, but if I get you on the mat, like people always say they're surprised how strong I am. Well, that's because I've been doing jiu-jitsu for, over 15 years. So like I have a good isometric strength. I have that mat strength, So there's that component as well. But then you have those guys who are like immobile, so one of the things that defines jiu-jitsu is the guard, right? Which is using two legs to manipulate the body, and the legs are going to be stronger than the arms. That's how a smaller person can overcome a bigger person, right? So, but to use your leg, it's not just like, do you have like a strong leg? A lot of it is having the hip mobility to kind of like get those outer ranges. Like if you ever watch people do these like weird guard, they're trying to pass the guard, but they can't get by those legs. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I don't know if I quite answered your question because there's not like a good way to go. There's some numbers that people have told me about, like, doing like percentages of body weight. So again, can you bench press, squat a percentage of your body weight? And then following that, there's like a diminishing, athletic benefit, right? Because you know what it's like because you work with combat athletes, but the strongest athlete is not the best athlete. Like I know a lot of the athletes that you work with are like, they don't look physically impressive, but they're still gonna, KO you.
That was going to be my next question, Mike, is where, in your personal opinion, let's forget like what the research paper, because again, you've probably done this more than anyone in the world with the most combat athletes and got the most hands-on experience. Is that where is that point where it's like you said, like you have 15 years of experience getting those isometric strengths, and when you lock on an RNC, it's tight and it's strong because you've just got that time on the mats. If we're talking to someone who's like brand new, are we saying to them and going, hey, look, you need to focus on this mobility and getting strong? Or are we saying, hey, look, just get on the mats and get used to these positions and move it? Or what are you saying to them? Is it a balance of both? In an ideal world, what are you doing with that brand new guy who just put on a gear and slapped on a white belt?
Well, so the brand new guy, that's a little bit different because that's going to be like a recreational hobbyist versus like the professional athlete or the amateur athlete who's been going professional. So I do think that if you are a new recreational hobbyist, you want to get used to it, I think it's good to a graded exposure to activity. Like a lot of times, like jiu-jitsu is so fun where like you have people like they train like 5 days a week, like, but their bodies aren't meant for that, right? So like I think it's important to do a great exposure to activity, but then you also have to do things to make sure your body can withstand the force of jiu-jitsu or combat sports, right? Because you can't just do jiu-jitsu, like your body's going to break down. So I do think it is good to have some kind of mobility practice. Again, depending on the person, it might not be the focus. And I do think doing some kind of strengthening is going to be beneficial. But again, like I think you don't have to be strong for a power lifter. You have to just make sure that your body doesn't fall apart. So most people can probably get away from like 2 days a week of strength training, having some mobility, because like mobility, in my opinion, is very easy to train. Like you just do it while you're watching TV. Like almost everybody can find 10 or 15 minutes to just do some, active movements and stretches or whatever they're going to do. So you can build that into your cool down. Like it just depends on how you want to do it. So, like I said, I think it'd be good to have some type of movement practice where they can kind of like take their joints through their full range of motion, maybe strength training twice a week, and then slowly build up from like 2 to like 4 training sessions. And then after that, like once you're thinking you want to start to compete, then we could get a little bit more specific on like conditioning or, adding technical training.
What does that look like, Mike, when you do get more specific with the more advanced guys and say they are pretty into competing and they're very serious? When someone comes to you and they're like, hey, Mike, I need help, what type of things are you doing with them?
So I think what you have to do is like, you kind of like, I break down like, one, we have to figure out what their goal is, whether it's like they just want to get strong, and then again, we could define that into more specific goals, because to get strong, like, what does that mean? Like, that doesn't mean anything. It's like, I want to be able to do this, or I want to be able to compete, or I want to, whatever. So we figure out what their goals are. But let's say it's like an amateur athlete, like maybe a purple belt. So I work with a lot of masters athletes because they usually have money to pay. And so, so again, I have quite a few people who are competing in Master Worlds tomorrow, actually. So those people, like, let's say Perfect World, they contact me, we start planning something like 12 weeks out. So I figure out what their weekly training looks like, because if you're already training, like 8 sessions a week, like it's hard to just stack on stuff. But like you could probably break down the week. Like I would say, like if we don't have any type of like performance enhancer, you probably can do, anywhere from like 8 to 14 training sessions per week, right? Like obviously, professional UFC fighters might be able to do more. People who are on steroids might be able to do more, but I think that would be like a good goal. So, usually what I do is I start someone with like maybe twice a week of like conditioning, because if you tell me you want to get ready for a competition, I'm going to transition from like a strength purpose to like more conditioning, right? Because I mean, potentially if they're 12 weeks out, I might do like a 6-week strength cycle and then a 6-week conditioning cycle. But again, they tell me what their goals are, and then I work from that, and then, so again, I might be doing 2 sessions of strength, 2 sessions of conditioning, and then they might be doing 4 to 5 skill training. And then as we start to get closer to the competition, I might start taking away some strength training. I might add extra conditioning, depending on what we're looking for.
This might seem like a silly question, Mike, but if you were to rate it, how important is it for a serious jiu-jitsu athlete to be doing these things, to be taking their mobility serious, to be taking their strength serious, to be taking their conditioning serious, to have a good structured training schedule, like you just said and laid out, heading into competition or having an off-season schedule?
I mean, I think it's really important because, if like, even if you're not a competitor, I think, again, everyone's goal should be able to like do their sport for as long as they want to. But usually what happens is their body starts to break down and they're like, well, I can't do this anymore. So for injury prevention, we want to make sure, again, like I said before, make sure you have adequate mobility to do all the positions you need to, and then to kind of strengthen. Right? Then we tack on that competitor. Well, when I'm working with a competitive athlete, I need to figure out what their strengths are and what their weaknesses are. Because there's some people, they may have enough strength for their weight class, but they start to lack the conditioning, whether they can't push the pace, whether they gas out in the middle of the round, or a lot of people just don't recover between matches, right? So if like for Masters Worlds, like most of my athletes are going to have like probably 5 matches to get to the finals, right? So, like, what does it matter if you like look awesome for the first match, but then you're completely spent on the second match? Like you got to make sure you're consistent. So, like I said, like I think it's important to understand what that athlete is missing and then add that in, right? So because like to say an athlete needs strength, yeah, of course they need strength. Do they need conditioning? Of course. Do they need mobility? Yes, they need skill training. But how do we fit that into their daily life with, they're going to be working a job most likely, and they have a family, so we can't just do everything. It's what are they limiting what is limiting them from meeting their goals, and how do we slowly tack that on?
Yeah, that's great, Mike. I couldn't agree more. Very last thing before I let you get back to your day, if you had to give your top advice, your best bits of advice for any jiu-jitsu athlete or any combat sport athlete for that matter, that is listening to this, let's say top three bits of advice for these guys.
Okay. So first one is don't neglect injuries, because what happens with most people is they get their arm popped in an arm bar. Like, oh man, my arm popped. It only popped 3 times. Okay. Okay. But the problem is when you have these injuries, they're a lot easier to manage from an acute setting. Like you just had the arm popped. It's easier to kind of like manage it and then kind of go through like a thorough rehab, which I understand that different people have access to different resources. So some people might not have access to good rehab. Some people might have money. I get that. But in a perfect world, you would go get it treated so it doesn't become a chronic injury. Because like I said, like what happens with most athletes is they start to develop an accumulation of chronic injuries. And then you're going to get to the point you're so injured that you either can't train or compete at the level you need to because you have too many injuries. Like your body can't do what you want to, right? So what do we do is you treat those injuries to not let them become chronic. So again, if you decide to stop competing, it's because you don't want to, as opposed to your body falls apart. You can't do it anymore. So that's number one. Number two is I do think, again, when it comes to mobility, you need to have as much mobility as you need for whatever activities you're doing. That being said, if you're going to be a guard player, like you need very mobile hips. It's just the nature of it. If you're going to be like maybe a stack passer, like maybe you don't need as much mobility, but it just depends on the position. Because what happens a lot with people is they don't have the mobility. They force their body in a position and then they get hurt. Like you'll take like inverting, right? So people rolling up on their back. Well, the problem is a lot of people don't have the neck, the thoracic spine, the lumbar spine, the hip flexion to get in that position. So then they try. Then when they try, now you have someone's full body weight on it, that's when they get hurt, right? So it's not necessarily that inverting is dangerous, is that person should not have been inverting, which is why they got hurt. So you have to figure out what your game is. And I know there's a majority of jiu-jitsu athletes out there that don't need to invert. But if you're going to invert, make sure you have the ability to do so. And then the last would be doing some form of strength training. Again, like I said, when it comes to injury prevention, strength training is by far the best for preventing injuries. And we can get a little bit more specific. Again, I threw some movement patterns out there that have a good bang for your buck. Again, if you can, I think training in ranges at joints like shoulder rotation, knee rotation is going to be super critical to make sure that when someone does put you in that submission, you can you have a little bit more ability to defend, escape, or worse, again, tap, right? Because what most people do is they wait until they start to feel pressure and then they scream. But if you give yourself like a little bit more time, again, at least you can tap out before it becomes a really serious catastrophic injury.
Yeah, all really, really good points. Now, Mike, if people want to reach you, if they're listening to this and they go, holy crap, I need so much more work on X, Y, Z, or I just need to bulletproof my body for this, or I need to get stronger, I need to get more conditioned, I need to do whatever, but I need to do it with Mike. What's the best way for them to get in contact with you?
So the best way would be to see me on Instagram, and my handle is the word Doctor_Kickass. Yeah, that's good. That's probably going to be the best way. I'm also on Facebook. I think it's the same, but Instagram is usually where most people find me.
Last question, Mike, how do you get these Instagram posts out so fast? I feel like I watch a UFC fight, someone gets like armbarred or something happens, and then literally by the time they get backstage in the change room, Dr. Kickass has a post about it. How does that happen?
I think it's just because because I've been doing so much research lately, like it's on my computer. Like, again, like I break down both the kinesiology and the anatomics of like a joint. So it's very easy for me to just type it up because I'm typing like all day planning this. So it's pretty easy to just write something quick because I've done it quite a bit.
Yeah, I highly recommend, if you guys who are listening to this aren't following Mike, Doctor_Kickass, very, very cool, very, very informative account. I feel like my jiu-jitsu's gotten better following it because I understand the joints now. So if I've got someone in like a joint lock, I'm like, oh, I'm going to go this way instead because I saw Mike's pose and rip it on and just absolutely bring them hell.
Yeah, man. I really appreciate it being on this. This is always a good podcast to be on. I like talking to you. So I'm glad that you and any of your listeners find my content educational, because like we talked about, there's nothing out there that like this. So, hopefully I can educate jiu-jitsu and combat athletes to be a little bit less foolish on how they handle their bodies.
Or maybe you're just going to be creating a little generation of beasts that know a bit too much, and you're just going to end up injuring too many people. But anyway, Mike, thanks for coming back on. Appreciate you taking time. We've got some cool things in the works that we'll talk about a bit later on, but I really, really appreciate you taking the time. We'll chat soon, mate.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it.